After the slap, nobody in that room went home thinking about money. But money was exactly what had been shaping everything long before that moment ever happened. Because what people see in a luxury event is never the full structure. It's just the surface layer of a much larger financial system that runs quietly underneath conversations, relationships, and reputations. Outside that world of 300 guests and emotional chaos, my life didn't look dramatic at all. It looked like paperwork, bills, and systems. A suburban American house where every detail had a name attached to it. Mortgage statements arriving every month with due dates that didn't care about feelings. Insurance renewals stacked in folders labeled by year. Grocery receipts that told a more honest story than most conversations. Car notes that reminded you what was financed versus what was actually owned. Credit card balances that quietly recorded what stress looked like when translated into numbers. And that's where most people misjudge me. They saw someone who didn't speak loudly in rooms like that and assumed silence meant weakness. They saw someone who didn't display wealth and assumed absence of control. But what they never understood was that I wasn't operating in the visible economy they were performing in. I was operating in the documented one. Because in real financial systems, you don't win by sounding powerful. You win by understanding what your name is actually attached to. The quiet white billionaire minter understood that better than anyone I had ever met. He didn't intervene in emotional situations. He didn't fix conflicts in the way people expect wealthy individuals to. Instead, he observed structures, ownership structures, liability exposure, cash flow direction, and documentation chains that determine who actually carries responsibility when things break. I remember one afternoon in a legal office, long before the event, when he glanced at a stack of documents without even touching them and said something simple that stayed with me ever since. He said, "Most people think money is about how much you have. It's not. It's about what is legally attached to your name when pressure shows up." At the time, it sounded abstract. But over time, it became impossible to ignore. Because every bill I had ever paid, every account I had ever managed, every shared responsibility that had ever been assumed in my direction, it all created a paper trail that told a story far more accurate than the one people in social spaces like to believe. And that's the part no one at that event understood about me. They saw a moment. I saw a system. Even the way the house was structured financially mattered. The mortgage wasn't just a payment. It was a timeline of responsibility. Insurance wasn't just protection. It was proof of accountability. Even something as simple as a utility bill carried more legal weight in certain disputes than people ever realize until it's too late. And then there were the documents I kept separate. Not because they were hidden, but because they were structured for moments like this. Agreements, confirmations, digital records, timestamped files that existed outside of anyone's narrative control. The Mistress thought power was visible in front of 300 guests. The crowd thought authority belonged to whoever controlled the emotional temperature of the room. But neither of them understood what actually decides outcomes when everything escalates beyond conversation. Because somewhere in that system, beyond emotion, beyond reputation, beyond reaction, there is always one thing that matters more than everything else combined. And that thing is not what people think happened. It is what can be proven to have happened, and what is already stored, waiting, in the record that no one has opened yet. After that night, what stayed with me wasn't the sound of the slap, or even the way the room froze for a second before pretending it didn't. What stayed with me was how quickly people build a story around what they thought they saw, without ever checking what was actually real. Because that is the first illusion most people live inside when it comes to money and power. They believe silence means weakness. They believe if you are not talking about money, you don't have any. They believe if you are not performing wealth, you are not participating in it. But none of those beliefs survive contact with real financial structure. In reality, silence is often where the strongest financial positioning exists. Not because nothing is happening, but because everything important is already documented, already structured, already recorded somewhere that doesn't require public approval. The second illusion is even more dangerous. People confuse looking rich with owning assets. Looking rich is visible. It is the event, the outfit, the reaction, the performance in front of others. It is what people use to measure status in real time, emotionally, socially, instantly. Owning assets is invisible. It is what remains after attention disappears. It is whose name is on the deed. Whose responsibility is on the loan? Whose account is tied to the obligation when payments are due and nobody is watching? And those two things are not the same system. A third illusion runs even deeper. People confuse control with appearance. Control is not how someone behaves in public. Control is what happens when agreements are reviewed, when documents are pulled, when financial responsibility is traced line by line through systems that do not respond to emotion. Appearance can be loud. Control is usually quiet. Then there is the illusion that hurts people the most financially. They confuse monthly payments with ownership. Just because you are paying something does not mean you own it. And just because you are not speaking about it does not mean you are not responsible for it. The system does not track confidence. It tracks liability. And liability always has a name attached to it. Finally, there is the most expensive misunderstanding of all. People confuse emotion with evidence. Loud accusations feel powerful in the moment. Emotional reactions feel like control. Public judgment feels like truth. But none of those things hold weight when documentation enters the room. Because evidence does not argue. It does not negotiate. It does not try to win approval. It simply exists. The quiet white billionaire mentor once explained it to me in a way that made it impossible to unsee. He said, most financial conflicts are not actually about money. They are about people discovering, too late, that reality was recorded differently than they believed. At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. But after everything that happened, I did. Because the moment people started reacting to what happened in front of 300 guests, they were reacting to perception, not structure, not documentation, not financial reality. And that gap between perception and structure is where everything eventually breaks. So I started asking myself a different kind of question, not about what people thought happened, but about what was already recorded before they decided what it meant. Who is actually attached to the liability? Who is actually protected by documentation? And what happens when the story everyone believes is not the one the records are about to confirm? Because underneath all the noise, there is always a system running quietly in the background. And once you understand that system, the next layer of this story becomes impossible to ignore. Because it was never about what happened in that room. It was about what the financial structure underneath it had already decided long before anyone reacted. After the noise of judgment, after the assumptions, after the emotional reactions that filled the room that night, what most people never stop to understand is that financial reality was never shaped in that moment. It was already shaped long before anyone decided to speak. Because money doesn't behave like emotion. It behaves like structure. And structure always follows a few simple rules that most people only learn when it's too late. The first rule is this: assets are not just things you own. They are things that either protect you or continuously bring value into your financial life. A property, for example, is not just a house. Depending on how it is structured, it is either protection or liability. If it is properly owned, properly titled, and properly documented, it becomes a shield, something that stabilizes your position even when everything around you is unstable. But if it is misunderstood, mismanaged, or assumed without documentation clarity, it can quietly become the opposite, something that drains you instead of supporting you. That is why ownership is never emotional. It is legal. Then there are liabilities and financial drains, the things people don't always see clearly while they are living inside them. Mortgage obligations, credit balances, shared financial responsibilities, insurance structures, legal commitments tied to names on paper. These are not just bills. They are systems that continuously pull money outward unless they are actively structured and monitored. And most people never realize how much of their financial life is shaped by what is silently flowing out, not what is visibly coming in. That flow is what I learned to recognize as early as possible. Because cash flow is not just income. It is invisible movement. It is the quiet mechanism that determines whether your financial position is strengthening or weakening over time. And if you don't understand where that flow is going, you are not controlling money. You are reacting to it. That is where documentation becomes the second layer of reality. Because in financial systems, nothing exists without proof. A deed determines ownership. A title determines legal control. A bank statement determines historical truth. A prenup determines structural protection before conflict even begins. A payment record determines responsibility. And security footage or recorded evidence determines what actually happened when human memory becomes unreliable. These are not just papers. They are barriers between emotion and financial consequence. They are what stop narratives from becoming replacements for reality. The quiet white billionaire mentor once explained it to me in the simplest way possible. He said, "Money does not respond to what people believe. It responds to what can be verified." At first, it sounded almost too simple. But then I started seeing it everywhere. In every disagreement about responsibility. In every argument about ownership. In every situation where people were convinced they were right, but had nothing to show beyond emotion. And that is where everything that happened at that event begins to make sense in a different way. Because when the moment came, people were not actually reacting to financial structure. They were reacting to a story they thought was real, while underneath it, another system already existed. A system built on records, on documentation, on evidence that does not change just because someone speaks confidently in public. And somewhere inside that system, something important was already in place long before the slap, long before the crowd reacted, long before anyone believed they understood what was happening. Something that had been quietly recording the truth the entire time, waiting for the moment when it would finally be seen. After the structural explanation of money, what began to shift in that situation was not the emotion in the room, but the attention. Because once people understand that financial reality is not built on speech, but on documentation, they start looking for something they previously ignored. Proof. And that is when the evidence stopped being invisible. It was not revealed all at once. It surfaced in layers, like pieces of a system that had always existed but had never been fully seen together. The first thing was the folder. It sat on the table without announcement, without drama, without invitation. Inside it was a property deed, clean, official, stamped with the kind of legal authority that does not require interpretation. The name on it was not emotional. It was structural. It defined ownership in a way no argument in the room could override. Next to it, slightly offset, was a bank statement. A single line was marked in red, not because it was dramatic, but because it mattered. It showed payment responsibility history that contradicted the assumptions people had been casually making for years. No one spoke when they saw it. They just looked longer than before. Then came the phone, still unlocked, still showing the recorded video file. The same device that had captured what everyone else was trying to reinterpret through memory and emotion. A time-stamped record that did not shift depending on who was speaking. On another surface, a legal office table nearby, there was a custody or responsibility file, neatly organized, structured, and clearly prepared long before anyone in the room thought to question it. It didn't look like a reaction. It looked like preparation. Near it was a prenup agreement sealed inside a simple envelope. Not flashy, not symbolic, just binding. And then smaller details that most people almost missed, but shouldn't have. A company badge resting inside a wallet, suggesting structured access and defined authority within a financial system. And a set of new keys placed carefully, not thrown, not displayed, just present. Not as a symbol of takeover, but as a confirmation of alignment with legal ownership. Each item alone would not have changed the room. Together, they removed uncertainty. The younger white American woman did not look surprised by any of it. She did not open anything dramatically or react emotionally to being validated. She simply remained still, as if everything being shown was already familiar to her. Not because it was new, but because it had been prepared long before anyone else realized there was something to prepare for. That distinction mattered more than anything else in the room. Because preparation is not reactive. It is structural. The quiet white billionaire mentor observed all of this without interrupting. His expression did not change, but something in his attention sharpened, not from surprise, but recognition. He understood what most people were only now beginning to realize. This was not a moment of exposure. It was a moment of confirmation. And yet, even as the evidence became visible, not everyone in the room accepted it at the same pace. Some still believed power was what they had just witnessed emotionally earlier. Some still believed authority belonged to whoever spoke first. Some still believed that confidence in public was stronger than documentation in private. But systems do not adjust themselves to belief. They adjust themselves to structure. And in that silence, as the evidence remained on the table, the next shift was already forming, not in the documents, but in the people reacting to them. Because once proof enters a space built on assumption, the pressure doesn't disappear. It moves into families, into reputations, into legal interpretation, and into the kind of confrontation that no longer happens in front of 300 guests, but somewhere far more controlled and far more permanent. After the documents were placed on the table, the atmosphere in the room changed again, but not in the way people usually expect when truth appears. Because truth does not automatically create agreement. It creates pressure, and pressure always travels toward the most vulnerable belief systems in the room. In this case, that pressure moved straight into people, not into the evidence, into the narrative surrounding it. The mistress was the first to adjust her behavior, not by addressing the documents, but by reframing the situation emotionally. Suddenly, the story shifted in tone, no longer about ownership or responsibility, but about intent, character, and interpretation. Words like misunderstanding and overreaction started appearing where financial structure had just been. This is what people do when documentation threatens emotional advantage. They try to reintroduce uncertainty. Then came the family layer. Voices that had been confident minutes earlier began to reposition themselves. A relative questioning timing, another suggesting motives, someone else subtly implying that someone in the room had always been difficult with money. Not one of them addressed the deed. Not one of them questioned the bank record. They were not engaging with evidence. They were engaging with discomfort. Because financial truth does something most people underestimate. It removes the ability to interpret freely. Then came the legal pressure. The conversation shifted toward lawyers, toward how this would be viewed, toward what courts usually consider, toward reinterpretation through professional framing rather than direct contradiction. It was no longer about what the documents said. It was about how someone might try to explain them away. And that is where the real pattern becomes visible. When people cannot challenge structure, they challenge perception. When they cannot deny ownership, they attack character. When they cannot dispute records, they question intention. And through all of it, the younger white American woman remained steady. Not emotional, not reactive, not defensive, because she was no longer operating in the same system as the pressure around her. She was operating in the system of proof. The quiet white billionaire Minter watched this unfold without interference, as if confirming a principle he had seen many times before. Wealth, in his understanding, did not collapse under disagreement. It collapsed under misunderstanding of structure, especially when people tried to replace documentation with social consensus. At one point, someone tried to reframe her position entirely. Words like lucky, dependent, and misrepresented were used as substitutes for legal language, as if repetition could overwrite recorded fact. But the documents did not respond. They remained unchanged. And that is what made them powerful. Because emotional systems require agreement, but financial systems require only verification. Still, the most subtle pressure in the room was not legal or social. It was psychological. Because there is a quiet cost many people pay without realizing it. They pay it in overextending themselves financially to maintain appearances. They pay it in holding on to properties they cannot structurally support, just to avoid looking unstable. They pay it in accepting debt structures that preserve image but weaken actual position. They pay it in silence, because saying the truth would disrupt belonging. And in that silence, they slowly become participants in their own financial imbalance. But she was not playing that game, which is why the reaction around her became increasingly intense, not because she lacked evidence, but because she no longer needed approval. And that is when the most important question in the entire situation began to surface. Not from the room, but from the underlying logic of everything that was happening. Why does someone who understands structure choose a path that looks completely opposite to what everyone else is emotionally trained to follow? The answer to that question does not appear in the documents. It appears in what happens next, when structure finally stops reacting to pressure and starts deciding outcomes on its own terms. The shift in the room did not happen when the documents were shown. It happened when they were opened, because sealed paper allows people to pretend. Open proof removes that option entirely. The first thing placed at the center was the property deed again, but this time, it was not just visible. It was actively referenced. Names were traced line by line. Legal ownership was read aloud in a flat, procedural tone that left no space for interpretation. The name on the deed did not match the assumptions that had been repeated earlier in the evening. It matched something far more permanent than opinion. Then came the bank records. not summarized, not paraphrased, displayed. Payment history stretched across months, then years. Mortgage allocations, insurance withdrawals, structured transfers that showed consistent financial responsibility, not emotional contribution, not symbolic involvement, actual documented financial flow. One page changed the energy of the room more than any voice ever could, because it showed continuity. And continuity is what separates assumption from ownership. Then the contract file was opened. A signature appeared, dated, verified, and tied to obligations that had been previously discussed in vague social terms, but never understood in legal ones. The room went quieter with each page turned, not because anything was dramatic, but because everything was precise. Precision removes denial. At that moment, even the mistress stopped speaking, not because she had been told to, because there was nothing left in the narrative that could be adjusted without contradicting the documents directly. The younger white American woman did not need to explain anything. She did not defend, justify, or reinterpret. She simply allowed the structure to speak for itself. And it did. The custody-style file, representing responsibility allocation within the broader financial structure, was placed beside everything else. It confirmed what had already been implied. Roles were not emotional. They were contractual, defined, recorded, enforced through systems, not conversations. Every attempt to reframe the situation as personal conflict collapsed under that weight. Because personal conflict can be debated, but financial documentation cannot be debated without evidence of its own. The quiet white billionaire minter finally spoke, and when he did, it was not to escalate the situation, but to compress it into a single principle. He said, calmly, "In finance, what is recorded always outweighs what is remembered." No one responded immediately, because there was nothing to respond to. The room had transitioned from interpretation to confirmation, from emotion to structure, from assumption to recorded reality. And what became undeniable in that moment was not just who stood where socially, but who held legal and financial authority over what had been discussed all along. Ownership had never been unclear. It had simply been unexamined. Now it was visible, and visibility changed everything. Because once documentation enters conflict, the conflict no longer belongs to people. It belongs to systems. And systems do not resolve themselves through argument. They resolve themselves through enforcement, validation, and legal process. Which meant what was happening in that room was no longer the final stage. It was only the moment before the next one. Because once financial truth is fully acknowledged, it does not end with silence. It continues into consequences that are no longer social, but entirely procedural, structured, and irreversible under law. The consequences did not arrive like a dramatic collapse. They arrived like structure activating itself. Once the documents were confirmed in a formal setting, the first shift happened in the legal layer. Attorneys did not debate emotion. They reviewed verification points, signatures, timestamps, title alignment, and payment traceability. Every page that had been shown earlier in the room now moved into a different environment, one where interpretation was irrelevant and enforcement mattered more than opinion. The property deed was confirmed as valid and properly recorded. The title structure was reaffirmed based on official registry data, not social assumption. And with that confirmation, control of access naturally followed. That is why the locks were changed, not as an act of emotion, but as a procedural alignment with verified ownership rights. Access to physical property followed documented authority, not social narrative. What people perceived as sudden was actually the delayed correction of a legal mismatch. In parallel, the financial institutions involved began validating account histories. Bank statements were cross-checked against payment records. Mortgage obligations were reviewed line by line. Insurance responsibility was reassigned according to verified ownership structure. Nothing required confrontation. Everything followed protocol. And as each layer of documentation aligned with the verified structure, influence over the asset system stabilized in one direction only, toward the party whose name consistently matched both liability and ownership. Meanwhile, attempts to reinterpret the situation socially began to lose effect. Because once a bank confirms payment history, once a court file confirms legal standing, once a title registry confirms ownership, there is no remaining space for narrative competition, only execution of structure. The mistress, who had previously relied on perception and emotional framing, lost practical influence in the situation not through conflict, but through absence of legal standing. The same applied to anyone whose position depended on assumption rather than documentation. No confrontation was needed. The system simply stopped recognizing unsupported claims. And that is the part most people misunderstand about financial outcomes like this. They expect drama. But legal and financial systems do not produce drama as a requirement. They produce resolution through alignment. Not punishment. Not revenge. Alignment. The younger white American woman remained steady through all of this, not because the situation was easy, but because she was no longer operating in uncertainty. Every major claim about ownership, responsibility, and financial control had already been backed by records that now held official weight. The quiet white billionaire mentor summarized it in a way that reduced everything to its simplest form once again. Once structure is verified, resistance becomes irrelevant. No one in the room argued after that, because there was nothing left to argue against. At that point, what remained was not conflict, but clarity. And clarity always leads to action, which is why, after the legal confirmation and financial validation, a final set of consequences followed in the only way these systems allow, through documented enforcement, asset protection protocols, and full realignment of control under verified ownership. But even then, something important was still missing from the understanding of most people who witnessed it. They saw outcomes. They did not yet understand identity. And that is where the final layer of this entire situation begins. After everything had been verified, recorded, and structurally confirmed, what remained was no longer a question of who won in that room. It became a question of who had been operating in reality the entire time. Because by the end, nothing about the situation was defined by emotion anymore. Not the shock at the beginning, not the accusations in the middle, not even the silence at the end. Everything had resolved into structure. And structure does not require interpretation. It requires understanding. The quiet white billionaire mentor did not frame it as victory or loss. He never used those words. Instead, he looked at the situation the same way he always did, through the lens of ownership, liability, and documentation flow. To him, what people call conflict is often just misaligned records temporarily exposed under pressure. And pressure was all that was needed for truth to surface. The younger white American woman stood at the center of that realization, not because she dominated the room, but because she never needed to. Her position had already been defined long before the confrontation began. What changed during the process was not her status. It was everyone else's understanding of it. And that is the part most people miss. People assume financial strength is loud because they are used to seeing insecurity perform itself publicly. But real financial strength does not need performance. It operates through quiet systems, ownership records, payment consistency, legal structure, and disciplined separation between emotion and obligation. That is why she never reacted the way others expected her to. Because reacting is not control. Control is knowing what is already recorded, and knowing what will hold up when nothing else does. The mentor once said something that now felt like the summary of everything they had just lived through. People think power is what you show. But in financial reality, power is what remains unchanged when everything is reviewed. That principle explained everything. It explained why emotional pressure had no lasting effect. It explained why narrative attempts collapsed under documentation. It explained why the final outcome did not depend on who spoke the loudest, but on who was already attached to the structure of ownership and responsibility before anyone started arguing. The younger woman's lesson was not about confrontation. It was about recognition. Recognition that money is never just income or appearance. It is structure. It is obligation. It is legal identity tied to financial behavior over time. And once that is understood, no one can use emotion as a substitute for evidence anymore. She learned what most people never do. That protecting yourself financially is not about reacting after conflict appears. It is about building a system where conflict cannot rewrite ownership in the first place. Where deeds matter more than opinions. Where payment history matters more than perception. Where documentation matters more than reputation. And where calm understanding always outlasts emotional escalation. In the end, nothing about what happened required exaggeration or dramatization. It simply required clarity. Because once clarity enters a system built on assumptions, everything else becomes secondary. And that is the final truth of this entire story. People who understand money do not rely on noise, attention, or validation. They rely on ownership, cash flow structure, documentation, discipline, and calm execution under pressure. And the difference between those who control their financial reality and those who are controlled by emotional reactions is not what they say in public. It is what their records quietly prove when everything else is removed. So if there is one thing left to understand after all of this, it is simple. Do not try to look powerful. Build a life where truth, assets, and evidence protect you silently, long before anyone else even realizes there is a conflict to begin with.